Today, we're not just talking about dry legal rules. We're going to trace the entire life of a promise, from the moment it's made to how we figure out what it really means and what happens when it all falls apart. Let's get into it.
So here's the big question, right? At what exact moment does a casual, yeah, sure, I'll do that, transform into something legally binding, something a court could actually force you to do? That's the core puzzle of contract law, and it's the journey we're going on today.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. How does a promise get born? What does it take for a simple agreement to level up into something a court will actually enforce? Well, it turns out you need a few key ingredients, and it all kicks off with a valid offer.
Now, this is a really important first step and one that trips a lot of people up. You've got to know the difference between a real offer and what lawyers call an invitation to treat. Think about it like this. An offer is a clear, I'm ready to be locked in. The classic example is the carbolic smoke ball case, where an ad promising cash to anyone who got sick using their product was seen as a genuine offer to the whole world. But just putting something on a shop shelf, that's different. That's just an invitation for you to make the offer when you bring it to the counter.
But just having an offer on the table isn't enough, not by a long shot. You need the other building blocks. First up, you need acceptance, and it has to be a perfect mirror of the offer. Then there's this weird-sounding thing called consideration. It's basically the price of the promise, what each person is giving up. It has to be something real, but the law doesn't care if it's a fair price. And finally, and this one's a biggie, you both have to actually intend for it to be legally serious. That's why a promise to your cousin to help them move house probably isn't a contract. The law just assumes you didn't mean for it to be that formal.
All right, so our promise is born. We've got a contract. But what does it actually say? What are the rules of the game? That brings us to part 2, reading the fine print. You know, it's funny, sometimes the most critical parts of a deal are the ones that nobody ever wrote down. They're invisible. We're talking about implied terms, the things that are so obvious that everyone just assumed they were part of the deal, even if they're not in the written document.
So you might be wondering, how on earth do courts just invent terms? Well, they don't. There's a really strict test for it, coming from a classic case called BP Refinery. It's basically a 5-point safety check. To imply a term, it has to be fair, it has to be absolutely necessary for the contract to even work, and it must be so blindingly obvious that if you'd mentioned it, both parties would have said, oh, well, of course.
Now, let's talk about the written stuff. And here's a line from the High Court that should probably send a little shiver down your spine. They said a person who signs a document is bound by it, and it doesn't matter one bit if they haven't read it. Basically, what they're saying is your signature is everything. It's your word, legally speaking.
Okay, so that sounds pretty harsh, right? You sign it, you're stuck with it. But the law does have a bit of a safety net. You've got to watch out for those surprise clauses. If a company tries to sneak in a really nasty or unusual term, like a massive limitation on their liability hidden in tiny print on a ticket, they have to do more to bring it to your attention. You can't just bury the bombshells.
So, we've got a contract, we know its terms, but life happens, and promises, well, they get broken. And that leads us to part 3, when promises are broken. What happens when it all goes wrong?
You know, the way our legal system thinks about honesty has changed a lot over the years. If you go back to the late 1800s, it was incredibly hard to prove someone had deliberately misled you. The bar was super high. But then things started to shift, especially with consumer protection laws. We went from that old, rigid view to the super powerful Australian consumer law we have today. And all of that history brings us to this, Section 18 of the Australian Consumer Law. This is the big one. It's so simple, but it's incredibly powerful. A person must not, in trade or commerce, engage in conduct that is misleading or deceptive. The key here is you don't have to prove they meant to trick you. If what they did was likely to lead someone into error, that's enough. It's a massive weapon against dodgy business practices.
Okay, now we're going to get into something that's, well, it's pretty uniquely Australian. It's a legal twist that really shows how our contract law has forged its own path, away from its English roots. Get this, in Australia, sometimes a promise can be legally binding, even when there's no formal contract. Yeah, you heard that right. No offer, no acceptance, no consideration in the traditional sense, but you still might have a case.
So what is this legal magic? It's a principle called promissory estoppel. It sounds complicated, but the idea behind it is actually about fairness. It basically stops someone from backing out of a promise if another person has relied on that promise to their own detriment, and it would be just plain wrong or unconscionable to let them get away with it.
And the case that blew the doors wide open on this was Walton Stores v. Marr. This was huge. Before this, estoppel was mostly used as a defense, a shield, as lawyers would say. But in this case, the High Court said, nope, it can also be a sword. It can be used to create rights, to sue someone and force them to stick to a promise even without a contract. This completely changed the game in Australia.
Okay, so the promise has been broken, the court has found in your favor. Now what? How do we actually fix this mess? That brings us to our final part, making things right, or as the lawyers call it, remedies. The law basically has a toolkit for dealing with a broken promise. The go-to tool, the one you see most often, is damages. That's just a fancy word for money to cover your losses. But in some rare cases, the court can actually order someone to do the thing they promised, that specific performance, or they can order someone to stop doing something. That's an injunction. So when a court awards damages, what's the goal? Are they trying to punish someone? Not really. The golden rule comes from this really old case, Robinson v. Harmon, and it's all about putting the innocent person back in the financial position they should have been in if the promise had never been broken. It's about compensation, not punishment. You might be thinking, why not just make them do what they promised all the time? Well, courts are actually really reluctant to do that. It's messy, and it involves forcing people to do things. They'd much rather just sort it out with money. They only really pull out this tool when the thing you were promised is totally one of a kind, like a piece of land, a rare painting, or in one famous Aussie case, a taxi with a very specific license.
And that's it. From that first little spark of an idea, that simple offer, all the way through the arguments over the fine print, to the moment a promise is broken, and finally, to a court order making things right, that is the life of a promise under Australian law.
But I want to leave you with one last question to chew on. A lot of these rules, these core ideas, are literally hundreds of years old. And now we live in a world of AI, of smart contracts that execute themselves, of digital deals made in an instant. Are these old principles still going to be enough to keep our promises safe? That's a big question for the future.